Good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Tanner, and I'm from the Institute of Development Studies. I'm really looking forward to being on Twitter for this session. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but yes, I look forward to the tweets and the retweets and so on later on. I really want to kick off this presentation with a bold proposition that we always hear, that children are the most vulnerable group to disaster events and climate change. It's the way of getting attention. Penrose and Takaki estimated that in the 90s, the number of children affected by disasters was about 66.5 million per year. And say the children's back of the envelope calculations with regard to climate change project that to increase from 66.5 million to 175 million per year, so more than doubling. And the proposition about vulnerability essentially argues that children are the ones who are least able to cope. They are more physically and psychologically sensitive, and they've also got less experiential knowledge to draw on and fewer resources to draw on with which to react. So a lot of the research and the work there around this kind of idea of children as vulnerable has looked at health impacts and impacts obviously on higher morbidity and mortality, but also the knock-on impacts in terms of livelihood chances, and the push factors for migration and even potentially conflict. Now, this narrative about sensitive children and vulnerability is very strong, in part because it appeals to our sense of responsibility and protection, and it serves as a strong call for action. The public relations people tell us that nothing says take action like a solitary child in distress. So it fits a kind of alarmist view of risk communication that's familiar to much of reporting in climate change in the media. It grabs our attention. Now, that's kind of one side to the child-centered approaches to disaster risk reduction and adaptation, but it's only one side. And being sensitive to child protection concerns, it is very important, particularly during and after disaster events. But let me put forward another alternative proposition, to some extent complementary, but alternative nonetheless. And that stresses agency and empowerment rather than passive victimhood. For example, children that we worked with in Tegis, in the Camotes Islands of the Philippines, they're not acting as passive victims to disaster events, but instead they're mobilizing the community to replant mangroves. They're recognizing multiple benefits, but they're able to articulate these multiple benefits that mangrove replantation has in terms of the spawning grounds for fish and other biodiversity, so biodiversity gains. There's disaster protection, obviously importantly, from typhoon winds and storm surges, and also more longer-term adaptation to climate change impacts. As well as, bizarrely, the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere as a benefit of mangrove plantation. Now, personally, I kind of think that should be the responsibility of people like me who've just flown there to visit them and therefore caused an awful lot more greenhouse gas emissions than they have probably in their entire lives. So, we've documented many examples of this agency through our work with Plan International and the wider Children in a Changing Climate Coalition. Other examples include organising the construction of speed bumps outside the school in Potrerillos in El Salvador. Now, I think this is a really important example because it illustrates the unique way that children view disaster risk. They view it in social terms and not, in geological or necessarily climate-related hazard terms. So the traditional way of viewing disasters as hazards. Another good example in El Cipres, a community in El Salvador. In 2005, during Hurricane Stan, the Youth Emergency Committee there took the initiative on themselves to facilitate the process of evacuating the families whose houses were at risk of collapse. And they established and managed an emergency camp in the school building, and since then they've worked to embed DRR principles within the community, wider community. So this recent research has helped construct this other narrative that I hope we can talk about today, which rather than emphasizing children as vulnerable victims requiring protection, it argues that children themselves also have a critical role to play in tackling extreme events and in adapting to climate change. So I'd like to leave you with three key kind of conclusions, messages for discussion, and hopefully they frame some of the other presentations too, and particularly the video, which should demonstrate some of these things that comes next. The first is that child participation, when we think about DRR and adaptation and building resilience, child participation has a variety of different modes. It's much more complex than the simple model of the ladder of participation put forward by Hart. Taking action, as highlighted by some of the examples above and some of the examples that were presented in the session, is often the highest profile, but our research has really led us to look at other roles for children. Firstly, as analysers of risk, and their kind of unique perceptions and the perspectives of risk that are situated within their lives and also their future livelihoods. The second is as communicators of that information, and that's crucial obviously to this the topic of this conference. And in communicating that, advocating for change and mobilising for action among others, both within their communities and outside. And finally, that process leading to construction of social networks. So, for example, linking community-based measures such as school strengthening or reforestation drives with municipal, regional and national initiatives, say to develop schools that are disaster-safe locations, or the national policy environments that prevent illegal commercial deforestation. The second message is that while the narrative around child agency is gaining momentum, it requires much greater attention to the way that the processes of risk perception, risk communication and risk management are constructed. So they're constructed socially, as I said, because children see things in a very different way, and the perception of risk may be very different among different parts of the community, children or those outside the community, that are particularly experts who come in to the community. And those are also politically mediated. So those perceptions about risk and how it's communicated and action that's taken is often quite political. Another example from the Philippines in Cagaut, in the participatory video process, they researched the community disaster risks and they filmed the discussion of their findings with local leaders. And the divisive issue there was small-scale chromite mining. It was a key root cause of the risk, despite its role in local livelihoods, contributing to local livelihoods. And interesting, of course, the demand for chromite is driven by manufacturers in South Korea and China, and by the global commodity demand for chromite for mobile phones, for taps and so on. Chrome, think of chrome. And its exploitation in that community was governed really by a provincial ordinance that allowed small-scale open mining for a distribution company in which the governor was a major stakeholder, surprise, surprise. But it illustrates how the root cause that drives risk and resilience isn't just about the climate, and it's often mediated by these global and national forces. So more intense rainfall is causing increased floods there, in part because of the rainfall, and in part because of the increased incidence of mining and the open pits and the deforestation that results. So what I'm trying to say really, final message is that resilience really needs to go beyond the community level solutions, and it's around considering the multiple scales at which the processes that support or prevent child-centered DRR and adaptation operate. It seems an obvious point that we need to work at multiple scales, but it's one we always seem to end up forgetting when it comes to implementation, because it makes things much harder to do. So in order to try and capture those kind of broader aspects of enabling environment, we put together a lovely diagram that I'm going to put up now. As you can see, the idea is really to try and get us to think about the enabling conditions from the household level all the way through to international level. And in that briefing note, in the In Focus briefing, we kind of lay out 10 components from our experience of that enabling environment. I do encourage you to read it. I haven't gone through it in this presentation, but I really look forward to hearing from some of the other presentations, and good luck with the rest of the session and the rest of the conference, and all the best from me. Bye!